What's that?
Oh, just my journal. I like jotting down theories and observations. You know, all about indigenous fauna, medicinal techniques, political nuances of amphibious species-based caste system.
On the surface, Amphibia may appear to be a fun, lighthearted, yet action-packed show that can entertain anyone, and to be clear, it is that. But underneath it all lies a very interesting story with surprisingly deep levels of lore, and that's what I want to talk about today. Specifically, I want to discuss the politics of Amphibia.
Politics are the worst.
Hang on, hear me out. I have my reasons for it. Politics can get toxic, I know, but this is fictional politics for one, so why get angry over this? Secondly, understanding the politics of Amphibia will put the events of the show in better context, especially for moments like Andrias' past, for example. Thirdly, it's my channel, and I'm itching to make some historical references with Amphibia, like what I did with the Owl House in my previous video. Anyways, to start us off, what does Amphibia's political system consist of? In terms of the government structure, it's relatively simple. For most of the show, Amphibia had a monarch, which was of course King Andrias. There are loyal advisors and military commanders who report to the king. Beneath the nobility of Newtopia, there are 4 Toad Lords. Each of them control a tower corresponding with the 4 main directions. There's Captain Grime of the South Tower, Captain Beatrix of the West Tower, Captain Buffo of the East Tower, and Captain Aldo of the North Tower. Beneath the Toad Lords are the mayors of towns, like Mayor Toadstool of Wardwood. Unlike the higher-up government positions, mayors are technically democratically elected, but it's almost certainly a toad who occupies that position, which leaves the frogs essentially no room to have any government roles. So while the government structure is relatively simple, the politics of this system are still rather complex. The basis of amphibian politics centers around the relations between the 3 amphibian races: frogs, toads, and newts. According to some undeciphered text in Marcy's journal, the 3 amphibian races were initially separated and often fought wars against each other. However, each amphibian race then got their own calamity stones, and thanks to the newt called Valeriana, yes, this Valeriana, the 3 species came together for the first time to unite their stones, and Valeriana created the music box. With this music box, the 3 amphibian races are united for the first time, and they use it to travel to other worlds, conquer them, and wipe out the life on those planets to harvest their resources, much to Valeriana's dismay. Still, during this peak of amphibian civilization, frogs, toads, and newts had mutual respect for one another. However, I wouldn't say they're equal. You see, even before Leaf betrayed Andrias and left the music box on Earth, there was already a societal hierarchy. In Amphibia, frogs were always the peasant farmers who lived in the countryside and didn't really have much wealth at their disposal. Leaf was sort of the exception rather than the rule, even during that time. Toads were always the militant group who were higher than the frogs in the amphibian hierarchy, but they're still lower than the newts, who are essentially the upper class urban elites and hold the highest political positions. So Andrias didn't create the race-based hierarchy like what the show implies, but he was the one who turned up the inequality to the extreme due to sheer pettiness.
That slippery little frog has ruined everything! Her and her kind will need to be kept in line. And as for you, you failed me as well. I'm having you reassigned. You will travel to the outskirts and defend villages. Now, get out of my sight.
Your Highness?
Over the centuries throughout his reign, Andrias eliminated the mutual respect that the amphibian races had for each other. This of course resulted in the amphibian species-based caste system that we see for most of the show and what Marcy observed. Frogs are the peasant farmers, toads are the soldiers who enforce the laws set by the newts, who in turn rule over everyone else. And all 3 races have a grudge against each other. Despite all of that, however, forms of the social mobility remain in amphibian society. We have seen examples of frogs who manage to amass great amounts of wealth living in urban areas. And there are newts who live in the lower classes of society, like Loggle and Wardwood. This may seem contradictory at first, but from a historical standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. Now I am gonna go full-on history buff here, so please bear with me. What makes understanding Amphibia's political nuances so interesting to me is how it closely lines up with how human society came to be. The earliest parts of Amphibia's history, when the 3 races were largely separated and at conflict, is the equivalent of human society being divided among small civilizations around the Mediterranean world, for example, like Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and so on. Then came one civilization that was able to unify the known world and conquer territories far beyond their natural borders. With Amphibia, this unifying civilization was Newtopia. With the Mediterranean world, this was the Roman Empire. And like Rome, Newtopia fell apart due to internal conflicts. The result of this imperial collapse is the formation of feudalism. For those who don't know, feudalism is the political system where a king or queen assigns territory to people like the nobility, military commanders, or knights, so they can manage those smaller areas, aka the political system Amphibia had for most of the show. After Rome fell, we got medieval Europe, which had this type of political system. When Utopia fell and lost their empire, King Andreas created the feudal system I described earlier. That brings us to the time period when most of the show takes place. When Anne, Sasha, and Marcy arrived in Amphibia, it was still largely a feudal society, and we see it rather clearly throughout the show. However, we also see growing cracks in this feudal system that has dominated Amphibia for 1,000 years. Remember earlier when I said there are some exceptions of frogs who manage to amass great amounts of wealth living in urban areas? Those are basically Amphibia's capitalist class, or people who set out to amass their wealth and power by starting up businesses, hiring workers, and profiting each sale the business makes. The other cracks we see are the Frog and Toad rebellions in Season 1 and Season 2, respectively. In Season 1, Hop Pop's mayoral campaign sparked discontent among the frogs in the valley, so significant that Grime had to stop it because that would in turn mean less revenue for the elites in Utopia. But after he failed, Grime, with the help of Sasha, set out to create a rebellion of their own against Andreas himself and upend this feudal system. Of course, we all know that was a failure. Or was it? That leads us to Season 3, where Andreas, with the Calamity Box in his possession, forced Amphibia through the Industrial Revolution in order to create the war machine needed to conquer Earth. But this rapid pace of industrialization came at the cost of environmental destruction and lost lives. Despite all of that, according to Grime's own words, it's implied that some amphibian elites still support King Andreas during this time, either due to fear or because they actually benefited from the industrialization, which was also the case for countries that had state-sponsored industrialism in our world. To Andreas and the core, Amphibia is reaching its former glory now that they have the music box and the military capacity to conquer other worlds. But really, it's more of a gilded age, where the economic output of Amphibia is certainly at an all-time high, but everyone who is not a wealthy elite is suffering greatly. With the world being such a hellscape then, it's no surprise that a resistance group formed against Andreas, and it consists of pretty much every frog, every toad, most newts, and every other kind of amphibians as well, like the Olms. And they're all led by Sasha and Anne. Side note here, unlike the other amphibians, the Olms were largely not involved with the political nuances of Amphibia's caste system due to their self-isolation, which was the best move they could have possibly done considering how Mother Olm knew how dangerous the Calamity Stones can be. Anyways, this final uprising against Andreas is, I guess, the equivalent of a populist revolution, akin to the American Revolution, the French Revolution, or the Russian Revolution. So yeah, that technically makes Sasha and Anne socialist revolutionary leaders.
Eat the rich!
This revolution did eventually result in Andreas and the core's defeat, but what was the political system after the Calamity Trio left Amphibia? Sadly, we don't have any concrete answers from the show or Marcy's journal. The most we got from the epilogue is that it's implied that Amphibia's government transformed into a delegate-based system, kind of like a parliamentary government that you can find in certain European countries. In this system, each of the Amphibia races have representation in a government body. As for how these delegates come to power and other nuances, I guess that's up to our imagination for now, unless we get more stories from Amphibia in the future, which I'm really hoping there is. But yeah, to round off my point, the way amphibian society was portrayed and how it changed as the show progressed throughout the 3 seasons takes rather similar cues from human history. Again, this is not really surprising, but I just find that cool as a history nerd. But this is also important to know because it really puts the actions of these characters into context. Andreas is like the traditional monarch. While he is a laughable goof when he's acting as a friend to close people, like most monarchs, he had ambitions of expanding his political power at the expense of others around him and to the population he rules over. In addition, there is also political pressure from the core and his father, who effectively forced him to act like most monarchs and rule with an iron fist, even when he questions the morality of his decisions. That's why he simply could not just follow Leaf's advice and stop using the music box. Stopping the conquest at the time would irreparably damage his credibility to the eyes of his father and the Utopian elite.
It's not that simple, Leaf. Our society is built on these expeditions.
When Leaf stole the box to prevent Andreas from invading Earth, his credibility only remained intact because the Olm prophecy guaranteed that the box would eventually return. With the political circumstances he had, you can't help but sympathize why Andreas turned out the way he did. This is not an excuse for what Andreas did during his 1,000-year reign, to be clear. The attempts to kill Anne and Marcy, the imposition of racism against toads and frogs, the environmental destruction of Amphibia, the murder of hundreds if not thousands of amphibians and humans, all of that is not excusable at all, whether or not the core influenced him. Remember, he was not literally possessed like what happened to Marcy. That being said, politics doesn't automatically make a person bad. While you may not view them as political leaders, Anne and Sasha were indeed that during the second half of Season 3. In the process of creating their army to stop Andreas, they were able to create a functioning society underground where the people of Wardwood could still live in relative peace, which is impressive considering the hellish landscape of Amphibia during this time. They showed off the best of themselves, and with the case of Sasha, ultimately redeeming herself from her previous mistakes. In other words, politics brought the worst out of Andreas, but it did bring out the best out of Anne and Sasha. So yeah, those are just my thoughts on the lore behind Amphibia's political system. Did I make any sense at all to any of you? Or did I lose you guys within the first minute or so and just forgot to exit from the video or something? Feel free to put down any opinions you have on Amphibia down below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more content like this. Also, thanks again to those who support this channel through YouTube memberships, along with everyone else who watches these videos. Anyways, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. I hope you all have a great day. See you in the next one.